There is a coat by a door on a rock 22 miles out, and the door is barred from the inside, and the man whose coat it is not in the room, and not in the tower above the room, and not on the rock around the room. And the light, 60 feet up, is still turning its great slow sweep over the sea, as though someone, somewhere in that small stone house, were still alive to keep it lit. This story is, very loosely, the kind of story that has happened at offshore lights in the historical record, where keepers have been found gone from a sealed tower, and the world has never quite known how. The men in this telling are not those men. The rock is not that rock. The names you will hear, the villages, the dates, the hands that wrote in the log, all of them are invented and meant to stay invented, inspired by real events. What follows is a dramatization. Begin. The stories told here are dramatizations, very loosely inspired by fables, local accounts, memoirs, and news of the strange. All characters, locations, and times are fictional, created to protect the innocent and preserve their anonymity. And then, with the first man through the door, Captain Ian Bray of the relief tender Hesper, 11 days late, his boots already soaked to the shin from the landing, puts his shoulder against the entrance of the Brannock Skerry light, and the door does not give the way a stuck door gives. It gives when it gives at last, the way a door gives when something has been wedged across it from the inside. He steps into a kitchen where the kettle is cold and the lamp is out, and every clock in the room, the long wall clock above the stove, the small wind-up beside the bunkroom door, the brass chronometer he will find later behind a locked glass at the top of the stair, has stopped at the same minute, 14 past 4. He calls 3 names up a tower that is, somewhere above him, still turning its great light for no one. And by the door on its peg, neatly hung, dry as bone, there is one oilskin coat. 2 coats and 3 men are missing. The coat that has stayed belongs to the man whose handwriting fills the last page of the logbook on the kitchen table, describing a storm that 22 miles east on the mainland no one felt at all. This is a case I have sat with for a long while now, and I will tell you at the start what I will tell you at the end, so that we understand each other. I do not know what happened on Brannock Skerry. No one does. The men who were there to know are gone. The men who came after are gone. The log is in a drawer in a building I will not name, and the page that might have answered us was cut from the spine of that log with a sharp blade in a steady hand, and it is not in the drawer. We have, instead, what was left in the room. We have the kettle. We have the coats. We have the clocks. We have a barred door and a print of salt water on the wrong side of it, and a light that someone, in the days before Captain Bray could reach the rock, was still climbing the stair to wind. That is what I can give you. I will give it carefully. The rock first. Brannock Skerry is a needle of black granite in what the charts of that century called the Carrick Sea, 22 miles west of the Carrickshire coast, a coast of low cliffs and herring boats and a single shore station at Cape Ardroon, where in the small hours a man read the western horizon at dawn and at dusk, and entered the wind and the glass in a ledger of his own. The rock itself was 3 acres above the water at the lowest ebb, and most of those 3 acres were vertical. Landings were possible perhaps 80 days in a year. The sea around the rock was not navigable on a bad afternoon. The sea over the rock in a bad month was not survivable. There was nothing else there. No second hut. No outbuilding above the cottage line. No cave on the seaward face that would not twice a day fill to the roof with the tide. The light stood on the highest point of it. A first-order revolving optic, 20-second period, visible 19 nautical miles in clear air. It was driven by a clockwork mechanism of brass and lead weights, wound by hand every 2 hours through the night, and it had not gone dark in any record I have read since the day. Almost 40 years before our story, it was first lit. A keeper went up the spiral stair in his stockings to wind it, and a keeper came down. That was the rhythm of Brannock Skerry. The light turned. Someone wound the light. The light turned again. A relief rotation kept 3 men on the rock for 6 weeks at a stretch. The tender came when she could, took 1 man off, brought the next on and went again. The Board of Lights had not lost a keeper to the sea in 40 years. which is the sort of sentence one finds written in the annual reports of institutions just before something happens that the institution is not prepared to write down. The three men on Brannock Skerry in the late autumn of 1903 were these: Alec Munro, principal keeper, 47 years old, 21 years on the lights, a widower out of the fishing village of Tarbet Hollow, on the inland side of the Carrickshire headlands. He kept the logbook in a copperplate hand, the inquiry would later call almost unbearably tidy. He smoked a short clay pipe that he had kept for a decade, in spite of a chip on the rim that another man would have replaced. He did not waste a word. The archive has, among its papers, 3 letters of his to the board across 2 decades, and they are written in the same hand and the same temperament, and one understands, reading them, that this was a man who arrived at sentences the way he arrived at landings, slowly in good weather, and never twice if once would do. Donald Price, assistant, 34, 5 years on Brannock, a reader, a married man. The book the relief crew would find on his bunk was open and face down across the blanket, the spine not yet broken at the page. His wife Eilis, in a stone cottage on the mainland, had a pot on her stove the day the Hesper landed, the same pot she had put on every Tuesday of their marriage, because Tuesdays were the day the letters from him most often came. Tuesday, that week, did not bring a letter. James Halloran, occasional keeper, 22, on Brannock for the first and only time. He had taken the rotation in place of the regular third, who had broken a wrist on the prior relief landing on a slick of weed at the foot of the steps. Halloran was a farmer's son from the inland town of Carrowmere, 6 hours by trap from any sea his mother had ever seen. He had been on the rock 4 days when the weather closed. His mother, in the months that followed, would not accept, would not in any private or public sense believe that her son had been on a rock at all. She said, when she said anything, that he was at sea. There is a way in which she was right. The Hesper was to relieve on the 11th of October. She did not. A gale came up from the southwest, and she turned at the 3rd hour out, with the boatswain shouting at the helm and the spray taking off the gunwales in white sheets. She tried again on the 14th in fog, and could not find the rock, could not find it, in conditions where the rock, if she had been near it, would have been heard before it was seen. She tried again on the 17th, and the gale returned, sent her back to harbor with a sprung plank above the waterline and the captain swearing into the wind in a voice the crew had not heard him use before. He made the rock, at last on the 22nd. All the while, on the mainland, the weather was bad enough to keep a tender off the rock, and not bad enough to break a window in Tarbet Hollow. The man at Cape Ardroon sighted the Brannock light at intervals through the breaks in the rain. He sighted it on the 11th and on the 12th and on the 13th and on the 14th. He noted in his ledger that the light was turning at its 22nd period, which is to say with the regularity of a thing being wound on time every 2 hours by a hand on a key. Someone those nights was climbing the spiral stair in stockinged feet. Someone was winding the weights back up to the top of their fall. He could not, of course, see who. He noted only that the light was on. He noted it again on the 15th, and on the 16th, and on the 17th. By the 17th, the men on Brannock Skerry had been gone for 3 days. I will come back to that. I want first to bring you onto the rock with Captain Bray. He landed at the slack of a difficult tide on the morning of the 22nd. The boatswain held the boat against the stage with a boat-hook, while Bray and a young deckhand, a boy of perhaps 17 out of a fishing family on the lower coast, climbed onto the steps. The gulls did not lift. That is the first thing Bray remarked on in the testimony he would give once and never repeat. The gulls did not lift. He thought, going up the path to the cottage, that this was because the gulls had grown used to the keepers, which is the kind of thing a man thinks when he is walking towards a thing he does not yet understand. He knocked at the cottage door. He called. He heard, from inside, nothing, and from above him the small distinct sound of the clockwork in the lamp room, turning the great optic on its bearings, the soft regular tick of a mechanism doing what it had been built to do. He put his hand to the latch. The latch lifted. The door did not move. He set his shoulder to it. The door did not move. He set his weight to it. The door did not move. He stepped back and looked at the door, and then he looked at the small window beside the door, and through the window he could see the kitchen. And on the kitchen floor, wedged at an angle from the kitchen flagstones to the underside of the latch, was one of the kitchen chairs, set there, deliberately, by a hand on the inside. He broke the door. The chair gave first, the door gave after, and Captain Bray of the Hesper stepped into the kitchen of the Brannock Skerry Light. The kettle was on the stove. The stove was cold. He put his palm to the kettle, and to the stove, and to the bricks behind the stove, and there was no warmth in any of them. Not the warmth of a fire banked for the night. Not the warmth of a fire let go in the small hours, but the cold of iron in a room that has had no fire for days. A teacup had been rinsed and set upside down on a folded cloth beside the sink to dry. The archive has a note of this in Bray's hand, written months later, the cup upside down on the cloth, and he comes back to it 3 times in the same testimony, as though the cup were the part he could not get past. Whoever rinsed the cup, he said, meant to come back and pick it up. The wall clock above the stove had stopped at 4:14. The young deckhand, sent to look at the bunk room, came back and said that the wind-up on the shelf beside the door had stopped at 4:14. He said it carefully, the way a boy says a thing he is not sure he is allowed to have noticed. Bray sent him up the spiral stair to the lamp room. He was a long time coming down. When he came down, he said that the brass chronometer in the light room, which was kept behind a glass and locked, with the key on a hook on the wall beside it, had stopped at 4:14. He said it twice. Bray did not ask him to say it twice. He said it twice on his own. And by the door, on the row of 3 pegs where the men hung their oilskins, when they came in off the gallery. There were 3 pegs and 2 empty places and 1 coat. The coat was Monroe's. Beside it, on the flagstone floor where the keepers set their boots in a particular order they had agreed among themselves, the place where Monroe's boots ought to have stood was empty. Holleran's boots were gone. Price's boots were gone. Monroe's boots were gone. The coat alone had stayed. Bray stood in the kitchen of the Brannock Light for what he later estimated as several minutes, doing nothing, looking at the coat. The boatswain came up from the boat and stood behind him in the broken doorway and said nothing for as long as it took Bray to turn round. On the kitchen table, the logbook was open at its last entry. It was open at a page. Monroe had begun 3 days before. The hand was the hand the inquiry would later describe. Neat, unhurried, copperplate, a careful man at his trade. The entries across those 3 days were short. They were precise. They described, in language no one on the mainland could match against any other record, a storm closing on the rock. A wall of water, Monroe wrote, taken over the gallery rail at the change of the watch. The tower trembling in its courses, Monroe wrote, as though the granite itself were settling. A noise, Monroe wrote, not of wind. He underlined that phrase once, lightly. He did not return to it. The next entry, the last one, began in the middle of a sentence about the lamp and ended 4 words later, and then the page that ought to have followed it was not torn from the book, but cut, close to the spine, with a single clean stroke.
Bray closed the log. He carried it down to the boat. He did not let it out of his sight again until he gave it, in the capital, to Inspector Cargill of the Northern Board of Lights.
When the inquiry sat, the first document read into evidence was the ledger from the shore station at Cape Ardroon. For the 3 nights Monroe had described his storm. The ledger recorded the wind under 10 knots, the barometer flat, the swell moderate westerly, the sky overcast. No vessel in the Carrick Sea logged heavy weather. No fisherman from Tarbet Hollow lost a creel. The storm Monroe described did not appear in any record outside Monroe's hand. This is the part of the case that breaks the easy reading. I want us to sit with it a moment before we go on. There was no storm. There was no storm at Cape Ardroon. There was no storm at Tarbet Hollow. There was no storm in the small fishing villages along the Carrickshire coast. There was no storm in the Carrick Sea so far as any ship's log records. There was no storm in the rain that the man at the shore station noted on his ledger, which was a steady, ordinary autumn rain, neither hard nor unusual. The Brannock Light, 22 miles out, was sighted turning at its proper period through the breaks in that rain on each of the nights Monroe wrote of walls of water and a tower trembling in its courses, and a noise not of wind. The storm Monroe wrote of was, by every measure the world outside Brannock Skerry could bring to bear on it, not there. And yet his hand on the page is the hand of a man writing what he sees. That is the part that has, I think, sat in the rooms of the men who looked at the log for as long as any of them lived. It is the part that sits in the room with me now. The entries are not the entries of a man unmaking. They are dated. They are signed. The spelling is correct. The sentences are short for Monroe, but Monroe in 21 years was a man whose sentences had always been short. They are the entries of a man reporting, which is, in some lights, the worst possibility. There are 3 further things to give you before we come to what was done about it and what was not done about it, and the long quiet that has been the only answer the rock has given us since. The first is the chronometer. The brass chronometer in the lamp room sat behind a glass that locked, with the key on its hook on the wall, and the glass, when Bray and the deckhand went up to it, was locked, and the key was on its hook, and inside the glass the second hand had stopped at 4:14. I want you to hold that in your mind for a moment. 3 clocks in 3 rooms of the same building, in 3 different mechanisms, on 3 different windings, stopped at the same minute. The wall clock in the kitchen, exposed, the wind-up in the bunk room, portable, and the chronometer in the lamp room, behind a glass that was still locked with no one in the room. The young deckhand, the boy of 17 out of the lower coast, I will not give you his name. The archive has it. His family had not asked for it to be set down, did not, after that voyage, take another posting at sea. He went home. He worked for the rest of his life as a wheelwright in a town 12 miles inland. He died in 1956. He never spoke of Brannock Skerry except to one nephew on the afternoon before he died. And what he said to the nephew is not in the record, and I am not going to invent it for you here. The second thing is the print on the door. When the boatswain, after Bray had gone up the spiral stair, looked carefully at the inside of the broken door, at the surface of the door that had been on the inside when the chair had been wedged against the latch, he found low down, near the threshold,
A single mark of salt water in the shape of a boot heel. It was drying. It was not yet dry. It was on the inside of the door. It was facing inward.
as though someone had stood with the heel of their boot pressed against the door, from the side of the door that had been barred, and looked into the kitchen. The third thing is the page. The page was cut from the logbook between Monroe's second-to-last entry and his last. The cut was clean and close to the spine and made with a sharp blade in a steady hand. The entries on either side of the cut do not refer to it. Monroe's last entry, the one that ends in the middle of a sentence, begins on a fresh page after the cut. Whatever Monroe had written on the page that is gone, no one alive has read. The cut, I should tell you, is not the cut of a man tearing a page in haste.
It is the cut of a man who took a knife to a book and meant the cut to be clean. It is the cut of a man who had time.
Whoever made it stood at the kitchen table with the log open and a blade in his hand, and made one careful pass. When the relief crew had searched the kitchen, and the bunk room, and the oil store, and the cisterns beneath the cottage, and had found no men, they searched the rock. They waited for the tide. They walked Brannock Skerry from the landing stage round to the seaward face and back, the boatswain with a coil of line and the young deckhand a pace behind him, Bray behind them both. The rock at low tide was perhaps 3 acres above the water, and most of it was vertical. There was, as I have said, nowhere on Brannock Skerry to hide a body. They looked anyway. They looked in every fissure a man might be folded into. They looked at the foot of the steps where the regular third had broken his wrist. They looked along the rack line. They found rope coiled in the oil store, paraffin full to the brim, lamps trimmed and ready, the beds in the bunk room made, Price's blanket turned down at the corner the way a reader turns it down to mark his place, and they found no men, not a body, not a boot, not a button, not a thread of oilskin caught on the granite. 3 men, 2 coats, 2 pairs of boots, gone from a rock with nowhere to go. And above them all the while, 60 feet up, the great optic of the Brannock light turned its slow 20-second sweep over a sea that, 22 miles east was a moderate westerly swell. Bray went up the stair, at last, to the lamp room. The wick was burning. The reservoir was full. The clockwork had been wound, and recently the weights were not at the bottom of their fall. They were perhaps a third of the way down. Whoever had last wound the mechanism had wound it within the hour, or near it. Whoever had wounded had then come down the stair, and crossed the kitchen, and gone wherever they had gone, and was not, when Bray stood in the lamp room on the rock. Someone wound this light. That is the sentence I want to put down in front of you and leave there. Someone in the days between the 14th and the 22nd of October, in the days the Hesper could not make the rock, was climbing the spiral stair of the Brannock light every 2 hours and winding the weights back up to the top of their fall. Someone was trimming the wick. Someone was filling the reservoir. The men were not in the cottage when Bray landed. The chair had been wedged against the door from the inside, the clocks had stopped at 4:14, and the light had kept turning. Who wound the light? And if the storm Alec Munro was writing about was real to the man who wrote it, and his hand on the page is the hand of a man who is writing what he sees, then what was he writing it in? The Northern Board of Lights opened a formal inquiry within the fortnight. Inspector Hugh Cargill presided, a man who up to this case believed in answers, and a man who after it, in the recollection of his colleagues, believed in fewer of them. He was 61 years old. He had been an inspector for the board for 19 years. He had presided at the inquiries on 3 wrecks, 2 collisions, and the loss of a keeper at a station on the southern coast that had been resolved satisfactorily in a single afternoon. He sat at the head of the table at the inquiry on Brannock Skerry for the better part of 4 months. Captain Bray was the first to give evidence. He gave evidence once and never spoke of the rock again. He described the door. He described the chair. He described the kettle, the cup on the cloth, the clocks. He described the print on the inside of the door. He described the coat. When he was asked whether he had interfered with the scene, he said that he had wound the light. He said it as though he were apologizing for it. He had wound the light because the light was Brannock and Brannock was the light, and one does not stand in the lamp room of a working light and watch the weights run down. He was not asked a second question on that point. He was thanked, and he was released, and he went back to his ship, and the archive has a record of his service for another 11 years. And there is no mention of Brannock Skerry in any letter or report of his that survives. The ledger from Cape Ardroon was read into the record next. The man at the shore station, a man, I am told, of careful habits and dry humor, gave the wind and the glass for each of the 11 days. The inquiry asked him whether he had at any time, in those 11 days, observed any unusual phenomenon over the western horizon. He said that the sky was the sky, and the sea was the sea, and that on 3 nights running between the 11th and the 14th, he had thought he could see the Brannock light through the rain a little more clearly than was usual for the conditions. But that this was, he said, the sort of impression a man on a long watch will form, and he would not wish the inquiry to write it down. The inquiry wrote it down. I have read the entry. It does not say what it means. The families were called. Ilis Price came in a black coat too large for her, which she had borrowed from a neighbor because she had not yet had time to be measured for one of her own. She gave evidence that her husband had been well, that he wrote weekly, that his last letter posted from the last relief landing had been the letter of a man in good spirits, that he had asked after the dog and after her sister, and had said he was reading a particular book he expected to finish before the next tender. He had ended the letter with a sentence he had not written before. He had written, "Kiss the children for me twice tonight." They had no children. Ilis Price read the sentence into the record in a voice that the clerk noted in the margin was steady. She was thanked. She left. She lived another 31 years. Mrs. Halloran of Carrowmere did not come. She sent a note in her own hand. The note said, "My son was not on that rock." The inquiry read the note into the record and entered it among the papers. They did not summon her again. Munro's brother walked down from Tarbet Hollow on the day he was called, and he gave such evidence as he had, which was that his brother had been a steady man, a sober man, a man who in 21 years had not raised his voice to him on any subject, and that his brother had not, in any letter or in any conversation, given him cause to think there was anything wrong with him on Brannock Skerry or anywhere else. He was asked whether his brother had ever, to his knowledge, written in his log of weather that was not there. He said no. He was asked whether his brother had ever, to his knowledge, kept a knife sharp enough to cut a page from a book in one clean pass. He said yes, his brother kept all his tools sharp. He shook the inspector's hand at the end, as though he were sorry for the inspector, and he left. The inquiry, after months of taking evidence and reading documents and corresponding with the board surveyors and with the meteorological office at the Capitol, returned a verdict of cause unknown. The phrase Cargill wrote in his own hand in the conclusion of the report is this: "We are unable, on the evidence before us, to account for the absence of the 3 keepers or for the condition of the station upon the arrival of the relief. It is, of all the sentences in the report, the only sentence I would call honest." Cargill did not take another lead investigation. He retired in 1908. The man who had worked beside him at the board for 15 years said, in a private letter that the archive holds, that Cargill kept a copy of the Brannock log on his desk until he died, and that he did not, in the time the writer knew him, open it. I will now walk the theories with you. Each of them has been offered, each of them has been argued in good faith by a man who has sat with the case as long as I have. I will name each one with the respect that the men who argued for it deserve, and I will set each one down. The first theory is the rogue wave, a freak sea rising out of a sea that did not generate it, taken over the gallery of the Brannock light, sweeping the keepers off the rock. It is the theory that requires the fewest moving parts. It is the theory that has been preferred when a theory was preferred at all by the men of the board. But the door was barred from the inside, and Monroe's coat stayed on the peg, and the kettle on the cold stove had been set to be returned to, and no rogue wave ever lifted a wall clock and a wind-up and a brass chronometer behind locked glass and stopped them all at the same minute. The second theory is the quarrel, a killing among 3 men, ending in flight to the sea. It is, I will tell you, the theory the families were never told had been considered, though it had been. But there was no blood in the cottage. There was no blood on the steps. There was no body. There was no motive any inquiry could pry out of 21 years of Monroe's tidy hand. And there was again, and I will keep coming back to this until you feel it, no one to wind the light afterwards. A man does not kill his fellow keepers and then climb a spiral stair every 2 hours for 3 days to keep their light alive. The third theory is the foreign vessel, a submersible, a smuggler, a wartime craft years before the war. The years before 1903 had been quiet ones. In the diplomatic record, there had been no ships off the Carrickshire coast that the Admiralty had not accounted for. There had been no wreckage, no witness, no reason for any vessel to land at Brannock Skerry and take 3 keepers off into the sea, and no reason having done so to set a teacup upside down on a cloth beside the sink to dry. The fourth theory is the madness. 1 man, then 2, then 3, taken by something that begins in the brain and ends in the sea. The storm in the log as evidence, Monroe writing what he saw, which was not what was there. It is, of the earthly theories, the theory that holds the longest. It accounts for the storm. It accounts, in a way, for the missing men. But it does not account for the chronometer behind the locked glass. It does not account for the cut page. It does not account for the print on the inside of the door. And it does not account for the hand on the page itself, which is the hand of a man who is reporting, and not the hand of a man who is unmaking. I have read that hand. I want you to take it on my word. The man who wrote those entries was not mad in any sense the word usually carries, which is, as I have said, in some lights, the worst possibility. The fifth theory is the one no one in the inquiry would say out loud, and which appears, in the inquiry's private papers, in a single line in Cargill's hand. That something came to the rock in the days the Hesper could not. That the storm Monroe described was a storm in a sense the mainland barometer could not measure. That 2 men went out into it, and one stayed long enough to bar the door behind them, and then went too, and left his coat on its peg, because the coat would not have helped him. I do not endorse this. I name it because Cargill named it, and because the line is in the file, and because the file is one of the things we have. Set them down. None of them holds the whole shape of the room. Now I want to take you the long way out, across the years that came after, and the long quiet that has been the only true answer the rock has ever given us. Ilis Price set a place at supper for her husband for 31 years. I have this from a niece, who is herself long gone and who set it down in a letter to a county historian in the 1960s, and the letter is in the archive. The plate was a particular plate. The cup was a particular cup. The cloth beneath them was the cloth she had been given on the morning of her wedding. She allowed herself, across 31 years, a few small variations, a different cup. Once, in 1919, after the original had cracked at the rim. A different cloth, in 1924, when the first had worn through, but the place was always set, and it was always set at the same chair, and she did not, in the recollection of the niece, ever sit in that chair herself. She died in 1934, in the spring of that year. The plate, the niece writes, was still on the table when the neighbor came in. Mrs. Halloran of Carrowmere lived until 1941. She did not, in any of the recollections that have come down to me, except that her son had been on Brannock Skerry. She kept his bed made. She kept his clothes folded in the press at the foot of it. When callers asked after him, she said he was at sea, and she said it in a tone that did not invite a second question. In a sense, as I told you at the start, she was correct. James Halloran was not, after the 14th minute past 4 of an autumn afternoon in 1903, anywhere that a son can be brought home from. Munro's brother walked the cliffs at Tarbet Hollow every October, on the anniversary of the mist relief, for 26 years. He walked in any weather. He walked alone. The fishermen of the village knew him. They did not speak to him when they passed him. He did not speak when he was spoken to. He stopped walking in 1929, the year he died. He had no children. There is no one now in Tarbet Hollow who carries his name. In 1934, the Board of Lights installed an automatic mechanism on Brannock Skerry. 2 engineers and a foreman went out to do the work. They completed it in 9 days. They slept, all 3 nights, on the deck of the Hesper II, anchored in the lee of the rock. None of them, in the records I have, gives a reason. The light, after 1934, turned without a hand to wind it. It was the first time in 70 years that this was true. The light turned the same. In 1971, a modern light was built on the mainland. The board declared Brannock Skerry redundant. They removed the optic. It was sold and is in a museum I will not name, and they removed the lamp. And they left the clockwork mechanism where it stood, because the cost of taking it off the rock was greater than the value of the brass. They sealed the door. The board's last man off the rock was a junior engineer named in the closure file by his initials only, who signed the closure log. The closure log was the last entry in the Brannock book. The book was closed and shelved in an archive in the mainland capital. It was not opened again for 41 years. And the rock now. Gulls, salt. The cottage roof has fallen in by stages across the 1980s, until what is left of it is a few black timbers angled against the lower courses of the tower.
The granite tower itself is still standing because it was built to stand. Lichen has come up the gallery rail in slow gray-green tongues.
A bird's nest, in a season I cannot name, was built in the empty lamp room, and the bones of it are still there. On a still afternoon at low tide, with the western light on the wet stone, the rock is, I will tell you, beautiful in the way that things that have outlasted their use are beautiful. It does not care that we do not know. It has not cared for 120 years. That is the part I find hardest to give you. The long quiet is the horror. Not the storm in the log, not the coat on the peg, not the print on the inside of the door. The long quiet. The way the world closed over Alec Munro and Donald Price and James Halloran, and went on turning, and the light went on turning, and the gulls came back, and the rock did not give us anything else. The Brannock log lives now in a climate-controlled drawer in a building I have already told you I will not name. I have seen it. Munro's copperplate is still legible. The torn page is still missing. The final entry still ends in the middle of a sentence. I will not quote that sentence again. So, let me set down plainly what we do not know. We do not know what happened on Brannock Skerry between the 14th minute past 4 of an autumn afternoon in 1903 and the arrival of the Hesper 11 days later. We do not know whose storm Alec Munro was writing about, or what he meant by a noise not of wind. We do not know why one of 3 coats stayed on its peg, while the man who wore it went out into weather that 22 miles east was not there. We do not know who climbed the spiral stair in the days before the relief crew could come to wind a light for no one. We do not know what was on the page that was cut from the log with a sharp blade in a steady hand. We do not know whose blade. We do not know whose hand. We do not know. We know only that the light kept turning, that it kept turning on the 11th, and on the 12th, and on the 13th, and on the 14th, and on each of the nights after, that someone before the men were gone was winding it, and that, in some sense, the rock has never explained, it has not even now quite stopped. Some absences are not puzzles to be solved, some are rooms to be sat in. This story was very loosely inspired by the lost keepers of historical offshore lights, and by the long quiet that has followed them. The keepers in this telling, Alec Munro, Donald Price, James Halloran, are inventions. The rock is an invention. Brannock Skerry, Carrickshire, the Carrick Sea, the shore station at Cape Ardroon, the villages of Tarbet Hollow and Caramere, the relief tender Hesper, Captain Bray, Inspector Cargill, Eyeless Price, all of them are inventions, in the service of a case that remains in the historical record genuinely and quietly unexplained. I want to leave you with the question I have been carrying. Whose storm was it? And I will ask you this one in particular, because it is the one I cannot put down. What do you think the third man saw, that he left his coat behind? Tell me if you would in the comments. I read them. I sit with them. And if you would like to be in the room with me the next time the archive opens a drawer, subscribe, quietly. There is no hurry. The cases are not going anywhere. Some cases were never closed.